Hello, Christina. You're on mute.
I was going to say I'm slowly but surely trying to finish up my income taxes.
Okay.
How have you been doing?
Doing well. Are you doing okay?
Yes, I am.
Great, great.
All right, so you're unmuted now. You can,
I'm ready to speak and they can see me and
well, I don't know if
can
you
they?
can,
from the-
because I don't think we haven't started the video. Here it comes.
We can do that.
Now we'll zoom you in.
Cool. And then basically 1:30.
Yeah, you've got people on the call.
Okay.
They'll be able to hear you.
Okay. Hello. We're officially starting. Any questions?
Technologically good.
Oh, okay. You have hopefully you have the paperwork that you guys get back on this thing back in the back. Got it? Okay, well, you printed, same thing. Yeah. Now you're Molly. Okay. Do you know Larry? Earlier? Okay. And you know Angie?
Yeah.
But she's the one in charge of your money. Okay, good. That's not the only reason we like her, but you know.
There's 18 people so far online, so.
Okay, well, good. Thank you.
Oh,
you
and
very
one
much.
more coming in.
All right. And I know Cindy Shell came by and said she had to go take care of a seller on a closing they've got coming up this afternoon, so. And do you have the material printed out or not? Okay, you got it. Good. Okay. Welcome all of you. Thank you very much for being here. And you got the email, I guess, yesterday that kind of talked about what we're going to talk about. And we'll obviously add to some additional types of things, particularly as we get into the multiple offer and dealing with those kinds of things. We have talked before about the coming soon, and that's the first thing you have in your packet, the coming soon, and then the clear cooperation stuff from NAR. There's some aspects of the coming soon that perhaps at some level maybe are not as well understood of what we can do and can't do and how that can work. First, the basics coming soon is a status is 30 days now. It used to be 14 days, but it's been 30 days for some time. And so when you put your listing in MLS in coming soon, it's for 30 days. And at the end of the 30 days, you have to take it active or the system would automatically take it to TOM, temporary off market. The other big thing about coming soon is there cannot be any showings during coming soon at all, period, none. Now, what that does not do, it does not preclude a buyer from sending an offer to the seller sight unseen and does not keep the seller from accepting an offer from a buyer who hasn't seen the property other than maybe driving by. We had one fairly recently where the buyer sent an offer to the seller and the seller ended up accepting it. Turns out as the buyer was driving the neighborhood, the seller was out front working in the yard and the buyer stopped and visited with the seller. And so they met and got to talk and had some conversation. They never went inside the house, but you know, they got to visit with the seller. So the seller knew who they were and the seller ended up accepting the offer. Seller has a right to do that. Now we have a form, pre-market advisory notice, that the seller has to sign off on that basically tells him, you know, while he can do this, he almost certainly could get more for the property if it was fully on the market. And there are reasons why sellers say, yeah, but this is good, this is plenty, this is more than I thought I was going to get. I don't want the hassle of all the rest of it, I want to take this. They get to do that, but they've got to sign off on this form. And the reality is, we also say, this offer you just got, maybe the only offer you'll ever get. We don't know, but you probably could get more if you put it on the market. So we have them sign off on it because they have a right to do it. So because this could happen and is happening, you need to have a conversation with your seller about how they want to handle that. Because one of the rules, one of the TREC rules, one of the NAR Code of Ethics rules is we are required to submit all offers to our sellers all the way to closing. So even though it's incoming soon and we can't do any showings, if a buyer's agent sends an offer over, we have to submit it to the seller. We have to say, here's Here's an offer we received. So you should have that conversation up front with your seller saying, this is what could happen. And if it does, we're going to bring you the offer unless you tell us otherwise. You could give us written instructions and you could say, you know what? While it's in coming soon, we've got a very special reason for doing it during coming soon. We don't want any showings, we want to hassle, we're doing things, getting ready. We just want to create some interest in the marketplace. But frankly, we don't want to deal with offers right now. We think until we actually get it on the market, get it active, have it for showing, we don't want to see any. So if the seller gives you written instructions saying, hey, those offers you get sight unseen, don't send them to me. I don't want to see them. He also will give you the authority in that instruction to tell a buyer's agent, here's what my seller has told us. You know, if you submit an offer, I will not present it to our seller. He's given me specific instructions during the coming soon. He will not entertain any offers. Now, having said that, the real world is buyers will walk across the sign and knock on the door. Hey, I see that you're going to be selling your house and we really love this neighborhood. In fact, our kids' best friends live 2 doors down and we really want this house. You know, what can we do? That'll happen. You need to educate your seller on what to do. You should have your cards, you should hand that person your card, say, hey, here's my agent, just give him a call, talk to him. Because we don't want the seller to enter any kind of negotiation with that buyer who just walked in. Because that's the beginning of a world of problems, or world of challenges. Because that buyer who's willing to do that is willing to do all kinds of other things. So you need to educate your seller because that's what could happen. Now, the other thing that happened during coming soon is the seller, and we had this happen too. The seller had a friend at work who heard about the house, you know, who was selling the house. He said, wow, you know, I've always loved that house. I think we'd like to buy it. Could you show us the house? Well, seller has to say, no, it's incoming soon, no showings. Now, seller sits there and thinks about it, says, you know what? That's a good buddy of mine at work. In fact, it's my boss. So I'm going to really be nice to this guy. I want to show him the property. Well, you're going to have to take the listing active, which then allows showings. You can take it active in no time at all. Now, once you take it active out of coming soon, you cannot put it back into coming soon for a year. So you don't get to just bounce back and forth and work it. You got to have a year gap in there. Come right in. If you haven't printed it out, there's paperwork in the back for you. Okay. And so here's the other side of that situation, because we did have this with the seller, had a friend at work, kind of wasn't his boss in that case, but had a friend at work. And so he wanted to work with him. Now, here's the thing. We don't control our seller's lives. We're talking about the coming soon type situation. We don't control our seller's lives. You know what? I understand no showings of the house, but he's a good buddy of mine and he often comes over Thursday nights for poker night and, you know, comes over for the weekend barbecue. So we're not going to tell the seller, hey, you can't have anybody come over your house. You know, you don't get to entertain anybody. They get to do whatever they want to do. We just can't have any official showings where an agent shows up with a client and shows the property or lets them in or whatever. But the parameters, the ranges of what could happen, what that could be, significant. We need the seller to understand, here are the rules. Here's what you've agreed to do during this coming soon timeframe. And this is kind of how that works. Any questions so far with what we're talking about from the Zoom folks? Anything?
Bob, did you say there's a form? Oh,
Whoops, I'm sorry.
Hello?
go ahead, Christina.
Bob, this is Christina. I have a question.
Yeah.
If during the coming soon, or actually even before going, it never went into coming soon. I was setting up my clients on a purchase that's going to happen this week. If it turns out that an offer was made and they accepted it and signed all the paperwork saying they knew they could make more money if they put it on the market, do I need to then go back and modify the listing agreement to change it from putting it in MLS to not, or?
Well, in the listing agreement, I presume you have that you're going to put it in MLS.
Yes.
Okay, that shouldn't change. The fact
Okay,
that they've accepted an offer and a contract, what you're going to do in MLS, it's active now, you're going to take it to active option.
okay. We did all that and,
Okay,
and,
so you're good. You know, you don't have to change anything in the listing agreement or do anything because they agreed to put it in MLS and that's good. So you're okay there.
okay, great. Thank you.
Uh-huh. James, did you have a question?
Yeah, did you say there's a specific form for the seller to sign if it's gonna be coming soon?
No, not for coming soon. There's a specific form if the seller accepts an offer before they have it on the market, before they fully have it on the market, which would include our internal internet thing and would include coming soon. Because what happens in coming soon, it only gets exposed to members of the MLS, doesn't upload to Realtor.com or Zillow. So there's a whole market out there that this property is not exposed to. It's not fully on the market. It's just an MLS and this very tight little parameter. So we would want that signed off by, and the pre-market advisory notice is what we'd have them sign off on, and we have that on our intranet. Or if you can't find it, send me an email and I'll send you one.
We would only have them sign that if they were receiving offers sight unseen.
Only if they accept an offer, enter into a contract prior to it fully being on the market. Now, the whole coming soon status situation, that's just normal, put it in MLS and that's the status you'll have in working through an MLS. So, you know, that's, we don't hang for there. It's just that we need to give them instruction that on this coming soon, we need to have the conversation about whether or not they need to tell us if we receive offers, do they want us to send them those offers or not? And that's not a form. That could be just an email instruction to us. Question? Yes, ma'am.
And so the contract agreement, how about the option period and all that goes into effect immediately, assuming it's during the coming soon. We're talking about the coming soon and an offer is given to the seller. So when does the option period and all that kick in?
Okay, so good. So the question is, great question. You're in the coming soon, seller accepts an offer. We've got an executed contract. And the question is, when does option, all those start? Well, the fact that it's in coming soon doesn't change any of the parameters of the contract. So what's going to happen is sellers accept an offer, they're in a contract, you're going to immediately change coming soon to active and then active option. And so their time frame for their option starts just as if it was in active status. So none of that changes. So you'll still be there. Uh-huh. Proceed normally. Whatever normal means in real estate. Okay, so.
As is.
Yep. Question, we good? That makes semi-sense? Everybody understand the question and that, because there's a tendency as we move around with these different statuses and so forth, that when we end up with a contract, you know, what are our options? What do we get to do? What's there? And remember, the rule in MLS for a change of status is 72 hours, which essentially is 3 days. So you have that amount of time to make that change. And we're going to talk about that in a minute when we get into multiple offers and discuss whether or not we want to make that change, you know, immediately or wait those 3 days, because we're having a lot of contracts fall out. And so we'll kind of have that conversation in a few minutes. We get into the multiple offer kind of thing. Any more questions on the coming soon? Make sure you have the conversation with your seller about what they want to do about offers that come in, because on some of the properties that are out there, that there's huge demand, you're going to get offers. And a whole lot of buyers are sending offers in, not just coming soon situation, but in normal situations. Buyers are making offers sight unseen.
Check the chat.
Check what?
Check the chat.
Check the chat. I don't know how to check the chat. Check the chat. I like your optimism. Tell her what we need to know.
You want me to come help you?
Let me check. We got a chat over here somewhere. I see this, and this. But I don't see the chat.
Hang on, I'll go into it.
Okay, let's see, here we go. All those things came up.
It's from me, Bob.
Oh, it's from you? Okay, then that's really important. Okay.
Of course it is.
Can you
I
show
said,
us
please,
when is what?
please remind the agents they have to have paperwork signed if they're putting it on our Facebook page before it goes live.
Are you talking about the internal stuff?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good point. One of the things that, and this is kind of the coming soon and also a little bit of the clear cooperation conversation. Before you start exposing anybody or talking to even our own agents about a property, you need a listing agreement. You need an executed listing agreement. And the seller in that listing agreement needs to have made the decision what they're going to do about MLS. So this kind of takes us into the clear cooperation and to the internal. We've got a service so that if you've got a seller for any number of reasons who is not ready to have the property coming soon or marketing or anything, need some time, but they say to you, you know what, you can expose it to your group, to your office, to your agents, and let's keep some control over this. Can go in there, and we actually, on the internet, we actually have, there are 4 forms. There are actually 3 for the seller that you use, 1 for the agent, 2 for the seller, that you have to sign off on, but you have to have an executed listing agreement. And this is something that you have to have. One of the forms that we have is a confidentiality agreement for access to the property. And the seller has to sign off on that. Yeah, you have to sign off on it. And any of our agents and any buyers who our agent gives information or shows the property has to sign off on it, because they need to understand the information on this property and the availability of this property is confidential to our office, nowhere else, just our realtors. Goes on our special Facebook page, no vendors, no one else is there, just our agents. And everybody agrees to sign off on this certification for access to the property. And so you have to have a listing agreement, as Marsh points out, an executed listing agreement to be able to do that. So good point that you make. Anything else, Marcia? Are you awake?
I'm doing multiple things. Nothing else. That's good. Thank you.
Well, now, wait a minute. Gary Keller said you can't do multitask.
That's because he's a man. He's a man.
Yeah, he's about, I forget. Yeah. Yeah. If he were a woman, he wouldn't have said that, would he?
Exactly.
Okay. Good point. That's a good point.
That's
So let's talk about, as we get into the clear cooperation, which is an NAR rule, which is on your next page. If there are no more quick questions on the coming soon thing, the people, I just did a class in our Rockwall office, and we talked about some of these same points. It was interesting. There was some lack of clarity between our internal and the coming soon. And the reality is the internal, that's information that's only available to the agents in this office. And some of the agents in Rockwall said, well, Bob, you're the broker here and you're a broker there. So isn't this kind of both? No, it's not. Only that office, only this office, only Rockwall, only those agents. It's not a, between the 2 offices kind of thing, just like it's not intermediary between the 2 offices. But the reality is, if it's that internal situation, we can't publicly market it. We can't put a sign in the yard. We can't put it in Zillow. We can't put it anywhere and have pictures on it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the clear cooperation. It's totally for our agents, and they have to sign off on the forms I just talked about to be able to do that. And so it has nothing to do with coming soon, has nothing to do with MLS. It's pre-MLS. It's pre-coming soon. It's before any of that happens. Does that make semi-sense? So let's go from that a little bit into the clear cooperation, because there have been some things that have happened that have clarified some of our earlier understanding about clear cooperation. And this is an NAR rule that started in May of 2019, where, and remember, NAR regulates all the MLS systems in the country. They're all under NAR. NAR essentially has all of them, regulates all of them. And NAR says, if you do any publicly marketing for a property, and you have one business day to get an MLS. Now, what's happened is we're beginning to understand at this point in time, their concept of NAR's concept of publicly marketing isn't related to a specific property that you identify or have a picture of, or an address or a location or even a town. It's if you say anything about, I've got some properties coming up, NAR says, you know what, that's a violation. You can be talking about properties, period, at all, anywhere, at all. Because if you're talking about properties, that means you've got a listing agreement. That means you have a relationship with the seller. And if you're going to say those kinds of things, you better get an MLS. You got one day to do it, one business day to do it. So we discovered, and we're dealing right now with a fine in our Rockwall office, and the fines start at $1,000. And 1,000 and 2,500 and then 5,000. So it's a very serious circumstance, very serious situation. So the coming soon, the Netris rules, and you see right there at the bottom of that page 7 there, that kind of talks about it and give you some examples of what it means to expose the properties. And in our listing agreement, in the Texas Realtor listing agreement, it has the language in there where the seller agrees. Because he said, I don't want to, put an MLS yet. He agrees if something happens that his property is publicly marketed by anyone, then it's got to go in MLS. And this could be one of the situations, for example, in our internal, we've got everybody signed off on the certification access agreement, everything. And one of our agents has a buyer, shows them the property, the buyer signed off on it. And then the buyer goes on Facebook and tells all his friends about this property. It just triggered our requirement to put an MLS, one business day. Even though we didn't do it, our seller didn't do it, it happened. And we'd be in violation if we don't do that. So it's a very broad requirement. But at this point in time, that's how NAR is viewing it. We feel like over the next year that will get adjusted at some level. Just like when this rule first came out in May of 2019, they knew that there would be no fines enforced until January 2021. But now that's it. And so they're beginning to have fines working through it. So the coming soon is anything that's public marketed that anyone outside of our specific office gets information on it, that's public marketing. Any questions on that? Very broad. So if you're marketing, you've got stuff on Facebook and you're talking about potential listings or properties, whatever, just don't, because we're targets. And what's happened in this for both the coming soon and the clear cooperation, agents are feeding on each other. And agents are filing complaints against other realtor friends or not friends or competitors or whatever. Because, frankly, we're all targets. So just be very, very comfortable in dealing with all that. Question on that? Anything? We good?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Moreno. What if the seller shares it on their personal page and then someone's,
Okay, if the seller does it, one business day goes in MLS. And that's what they agreed to in the listing agreement.
Okay.
If anyone does it, including the seller, that triggers it. And we have to put it in MLS, have one business day to do it.
Okay.
So if the seller is at a, barbecue or something like that, and starts talking to the group about their house that they are about ready to sell, that triggered it right there. Because one of the people in that barbecue happens to be a realtor who wants to file a complaint. They just need to understand they can't talk about it. They can't do anything while they're in that internal confidential position. If they want to start talking about it, let's get into coming soon. Let's do something else with it. Because when it's not in MLS, there are limitations on what can happen. Significant. Does that answer that?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to see if I can scroll down on this. Okay, so the addendum. Property subject to mandatory membership in a property owner association, mandatory HOA, which we have a lot of in our area. And we all understand the basic concept. But there's some things changing. There's some things that we should be aware of as we use this, because we've fallen into the rut of A1 is automatic. Everybody checks off A1. And I understand that from a buyer standpoint. Buyer says, I like this right of termination. I like having this control factor. And sellers aren't really paying attention. They don't really understand the other choices on this addendum. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is the listing agent in a multiple offer situation needs to understand what these other choices may mean to the seller. And the seller may not want to give this buyer this right of termination. This can be viewed as important as an appraisal waiver, or maybe even more important, because essentially this becomes a free option period. We're going to talk about the combination of using this, particularly if the buyer is able to get away with A1, which in most cases they will, because sellers are not paying attention, the listing agents are not paying attention. They don't even know how the other choices work, so they don't know to counter with another choice. I've got one good broker friend, and she's very smart, and she deals with high-end properties. And she understands what's going on here. And she always advises her sellers, what you should consider in a counter, if we have a lot of interest in the property, is checking off A4. So the buyer doesn't get the subdivision information. Now, what this also means, by the way, is the title company is going to require a resale certificate. They're going to need that, and somebody's going to have to pay for it. And we decide on that in paragraph D. In paragraph D, authorization, we decide who's going to pay for the resale certificate, pay for that information. But the seller says, I want to take away the buyer's right to terminate based on the receipt of the subdivision information. Because what 4 says is they don't need it. They don't require it. Title company says, well, we're glad the buyer doesn't, but we do. So we need to have it. But buyer has no rights of termination related to receipt or non-receipt of the information. Now, under the law, which was changed in the last legislative session, a buyer has the authority and has the right to order up the HOA information. Unfortunately, most HOAs don't respect that. Most HOAs say, I'll only hear from the title company. That's the only people want to hear from. Sometimes they'll agree to the seller because, seller owns the property and is a seller. The only time that most of the HOAs will allow the buyer to do is say, well, when you see there's a contract. And then what they always require of the seller or the buyer is, okay, we'll do it, but you're going to pay for it now. We want the money now as you work through it. Because when you look at the other choices and you see what we're dealing with there, then you do have a situation in which you can change who's going to pay for the information, and you also can change some of the rights. Now, the big change clearly is A4. Buyer said, don't need it. Now, this, by the way, may be a totally legitimate situation, because in many, particularly in some of your higher end properties, they're moving from one house to another house in that same HOA. And buyer says, I don't need it. In fact, I was the president last year. I wrote some of that stuff. So what do I need that for? Now, title company's still going to need a resale certificate. So, A4 may be a very valid choice for a buyer. And the subdivision information, except for the resale certificate, is on public record anyway. It's recorded in public record, so it can always obtain it there. And all the good larger HOAs have done that. So A4 may be a valid thing. In fact, because we understand a seller may see A4 as really a considerably improved offer, then a buyer who's in that position to do this may go ahead and put this in their offer to make their offer better than other offers that have A1 checked off. Now, if the buyer does that, what the buyer's agent almost certainly going to have to do is educate the listing agent, because the listing agent won't understand what this really means. Okay, A4, I've never seen that before. What do you mean he doesn't require one? How can he not require one? Got to have that. I mean, you may have to explain it to them, educate them, and help them understand how this is better for the seller. And then we simply negotiate who's going to pay for it down in paragraph D. Many of the things that we talk about in multiple offer that we may want to use and make use of. Not all listing agents understand what they mean and the advantages and the plus and the minuses for the seller. Sometimes you have to explain it without preaching, without, okay, obviously you're not very bright, so let me explain this to you. We'll go through this one more time. Take notes, please, because this is it's not easy. I understand you're just a realtor person, so you probably don't understand much anyway, so, which is, by the way, the conversation we generally have with an attorney. I know you're just a broker, so I'll try to talk slow so you'll understand this, how that works. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with 4, the easy example. But let's look at 2 and 3, A2 and A3. Because when you've got a seller and your seller is in a good situation, lots of interest on the property, maybe already multiple offers, they may want to look and see, and you may want to see if your buyer is better off in choosing A2 or A3. Now, A2 has an unusual situation. Buyer's going to obtain it, buyer's going to pay for it, and he's going to give it to the seller. Now, first question is, well, why does the seller need it? Well, they don't, but that's the choice they're making. So if the buyer does obtain it, and there's a blank here, and this blank in A2 has a different meaning than the blank in A1, which we'll go back to in just a minute. So the blank in A2, if the buyer obtains the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after buyer receives subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, get your earnest money back. Doesn't have to have a reason for it. So buyer obtains it, and let's say that the buyer puts the information in here and he puts 10 days, whatever the time frame is, buyer's going to obtain it, buyer gets it, buyer sends it to the seller. And then once the buyer has done that, certainly within that time frame, gives it to the seller, buyer's got 3 days after doing that, after the buyer received the subdivision information and gets it to the seller, buyer can terminate for any reason. Remember, the rights of termination on this addendum are not specific to how the buyer feels about the information. There doesn't have to be any reason, doesn't have to be anything that, oh, wait a minute, I was wanting to do this and the HOA won't let me do this, so I'm going to they don't need a reason. It's an any reason. Their right of termination is based on the receipt or non-receipt of the information. That is incredibly misunderstood. We have agents, whoa, your buyer doesn't have a right to terminate. We haven't even ordered it up yet. How can you terminate when you don't even know what's in there? You don't need to know what's in there. You don't have to know what's in there. Buyers can say, I woke up this morning and said, what were we thinking? Don't want to buy that house. We're out of here. And if you're within the timeline, you get to do it. So as you continue into 3 days after that, earnest money, if buyer due to factors beyond buyer's control, where that normally will come into play is the buyer orders it up from the HOA and the HOA won't get it to them. Say, hey, we'll talk to the title company. You're the buyer. We're not going to talk to you. We're not going to give you anything. Well, buyer don't have any control over that. So the buyer says, well, it's beyond my control. So if they're not able to obtain it within the time required, let's say we got 10 days in there, they don't have any beyond their control, buyer's sole remedy can terminate the contract 3 days after the timeline passes and get their earnest money back. So it's an important right of termination for the buyer, but it's tied to this factor of, they've got to order it up. If they just lazy around and don't do anything and order it up, then they don't have that right. But if something happens that they're not able to get it, and mostly it's going to be the HOA doesn't respond. Because some of the HOAs out there, as some of the smaller ones, total volunteer service, sometimes you can't even figure out who they are. And get in touch with them can really be hard sometimes. But those are important rights in paragraph 2. So one of the challenges to the seller is when they look at number 2, if the buyer makes that choice, on one hand says, okay, well, good. That helps me with my net because the seller's going to pay for it. The buyer's going to pay for it. Everything's taken care of there. So, but wait a minute, they still have termination rights. They still have a timeline here. We've still got a time frame, even though the buyer is going to pay for the subdivision information, including any rush fee, anything that happens there. They still have a right to terminate. And then if they can't get the information because the HOA won't cooperate, they have rights of termination. So the seller needs to understand if A2 is checked off, there are significant rights of termination for the buyer and there are timelines there that mean something. Timelines in A1 mean virtually nothing. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So A2 is an interesting thing. I rarely see A2 checked off. And frankly, most of the reason is nobody understands it. I don't know why the broker lawyer committee added that. When I was on the broker lawyer committee, that wasn't there. We didn't have that choice. And so they added a letter and I go, what are you thinking? What's the point here? And there are some, but it's unusual. And I'm sure with some of the attorneys saying, well, you know what? We need to have a situation where the buyer's got the right to obtain it. The buyer's got the right to pay for it. We don't have to wait on the seller doing all this. Well, sure, but you got some other things in there. Now, A3 is where you get into your updated resale certificate. A buyer has received it because sometimes a good listing agent would already have the information. They list a property. They know it's going to go quickly. It's going to get a lot of offers. It'll sell quickly. We don't have to worry about the lag of time on the resale certificate. So they go ahead and order all that up. And they already have given that information to the buyer's agent. And so the buyer's agent says they've already got it and they've approved it. Then the buyer has to decide, do they want an updated resale certificate or not? Now, title companies will look at the timeline on a resale certificate. And for the most part, most of them are okay with if it's, a few days, even 30 days. They may want to get something from the HOA if there's any kind of an update or thing. And they usually get it sometimes verbally. Because if you go for an updated resale certificate, that's typically about another $50 that you work through on that. But the key here, seller, is the buyer needs to make a choice. And if the buyer does choose, yeah, I want it updated, then if the buyer doesn't require it, seller at buyer's expense. So the buyer's going to pay for it, but the seller shall deliver to the buyer within 10 days after receiving payment for the updated resale. So the buyer has to pay for it. And then 10 days after that, seller has to make sure they deliver it to the buyer. And the buyer may terminate the contract or may refund it to the buyer if seller fails to deliver the updated resale within the time required. So that 10 days is an important timeline. If a seller doesn't get that done within 10 days after the buyer pays for it, then the buyer can terminate. So A3 could be a good choice. And frankly, most of the time, if your listing agent is going ahead and pull together the subdivision information resale certificate, the buyer probably does not need an updated certificate because title companies are probably not going to require it. So A3 could be a good choice for a buyer, particularly if they choose that the buyer does not require an updated resale certificate.
Quick question on that, Bob.
Yes, ma'am.
Addison McKissick. On that 10 days, is that 10 business days or is that 10 days total?
10 calendar days. Good
Fantastic.
question. 10 calendar days.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Unless the parties change it, it'll be calendar days. And every once in a while, you'll have some that do. Sometimes in your addendums, resale, in your relocation companies or other institutional addendums, they'll change calendar to business, but otherwise it's calendar days. Now let's go back real quick to the timeline in paragraph A1. Incredibly misunderstood by many title companies. They see this as a requirement for the seller, and it's not. The seller is not in default. The seller has no obligation to do this within that time frame because the total consequence to the seller, if they don't get the subdivision information to the buyer within the time frame, buyer can terminate the contract for any reason. Because the buyer has a right to terminate the contract from day one of the contract until they receive it and 3 days after or closing, whichever comes first. If the buyer never receives it, which on the day of closing, on the day of the contract, they generally don't have it. So if they don't have it, terminate right then. It turns money back. So the penalty to the seller by not getting it to the buyer as soon as possible is it puts the buyer in control of the contract. That's a free option period. So the number of days in there becomes a suggestion. And from a buyer standpoint, it can be a good negotiating point. You know, you may put 20 days in there, unless your buyer says, I need this information as soon as possible because I'm worried about things I've heard about this HOA. I really need to see this really quickly. Unless you've got a buyer who's pushing for that, and most of them aren't, put a longer time frame in there. And it'll sometimes lull a listing agent seller into a false sense of security. In fact, sometimes they'll say, wow, thank you very much. We don't have to rush because you know how these HOAs are. This will keep us from having a rush fee. So this is great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the 23-day free option period. Because that's what they just gave your buyer. So this becomes that. Now, here's what you have to watch out for. Some title companies, not the best, but some title companies will see this as a requirement of the seller. And if you've got 5 days in there, there will almost always be a rush fee. And so if the title companies orders it up, say, hey, seller's got to do this in 5 days or they're in default. No, they're not. Well, we're just trying to help the seller comply with the contract. No, it's not your job. But if the title company orders it up without talking to the listing agent or the seller, our position is, because that's happened to us, was in a 10-day time frame, HOA still charged a rush fee. Didn't talk to us. We explained nicely to the title company, you will pay the rush fee because you didn't have the authority to order this up. Well, we're trying to help your seller comply. No, 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 no. You need to understand, you haven't even read this paragraph. You don't understand it. So that time frame is not an obligation of the seller. Whatever you put in there becomes a suggestion, and it does not change the right of the buyer to terminate, because the buyer's right to terminate under A1 is totally subject to the receipt or non-receipt of the information. And that's it. Has nothing to do with the number of days in paragraph A1. Questions on that? So here's some negotiating points that we've been talking about. Some of our agents are already involved in and doing. We've already done this. In fact, one of our agents, when I was doing this in Rockwall, one of my experienced agents over there said, well, Bob, if I do this, if I've got that, and I know the HOA takes at least 10 days, give this stuff, why does my buyer pay for an option period? If you have it here for 13 days free, why should I pay $250 for an option? Especially because many sellers and listing agents will view an offer without an option provision as a better offer. Now, they're wrong, but I understand why that might be the case. So he said, why would my buyer do it? Well, there's a reason. The expectation on the seller side and the listing side is you're going to pay for an option period. And during that option period, you're going to do inspections and we're going to negotiate repairs. That's our expectation. That's the norm. That's what happens in the marketplace. If you didn't do an option, you'll hear listing agents say, you're going to do an inspection? Okay, I guess you have a right to do an inspection, but you don't get, seller doesn't have to do anything because you didn't do the option. Well, seller doesn't have to do any repairs anyway. There are no requirements for seller to do repairs. Has nothing to do with the option. And the buyer's right to inspect and all that access property is in 7A of the contract, not paragraph 5 where you have termination option now. But they don't understand that on the other side. So sometimes if you can get away with maybe $100 for a 7 or a 10-day option period, or even a 5-day option period, it helps the other side say, yeah, okay, this is normal, everything is good. This is when they're going to do their inspection to get that done. Because if you don't do an option and then you do an inspection and you start to try to negotiate repairs during the HOA timeline, that listing agent's got their nose out of joint because they didn't understand how that worked and they could really screw up your repair negotiations. So you got to look at kind of what's going on there. And sometimes your buyer may say, yeah, I can see it's good to invest a little money in that option because that's kind of what they expect. Now, if the agent on the other side is a listing agent with either this office or Rockwall, it shouldn't be a problem because they've been trained. We've had the conversation. So they understand what that right of termination in the HOA means and what that. Now, having said that, if you're using this, you may not totally eliminate the option, but you may shorten the option period. Maybe your 2 or 3 day option period, $100. Because they'll say, wow, that's pretty impressive. That's a pretty serious buyer. they're gonna get their inspection, everything done pretty quickly. So they only need 3 days here. That's great. So, and you're saying going. You're going, fine, yep, not a problem, because you got the HOA. And so you're covered there. Now, if it's not the mandatory HOA, you better look to other rights of termination. Financing, property approval, buyer approval, seller disclosure notice, other types of rights of termination as you work through it. But do you see how the HOA can work in conjunction with the option period and work in conjunction with the negotiation, particularly in a multiple offer? Now, because of the way this happens, when you got the buyer and your buyer is just getting so frustrated, they've already lost 3 and they're not sure they can live through losing another deal. If you make an offer with A4 checked off and educate the listing agent, that might be the difference in your buyer's offer getting accepted. Because that may be really showing the seller and the listing agent, this is a serious buyer. We're not looking for a right to terminate based on the HOA. Because that's what this is. This is a big right of termination, very important right of termination. And the property's in a mandatory HOA and your buyer understands these choices, they may look at something other than A1, but, and not to be critical at any level or condescending at any level, although I am, you may have to educate the listing agent for them to understand, here's why this offer is better than all the rest of them because of this. And you'll see a couple other things that we're going to talk about when we get to the next page. Any questions on the HOA and what we're doing there? And how that works?
Can I make a comment, please?
Yes,
Marcia.
ma'am, you can always make a comment. I am always
Oh.
glad to hear from you.
You're so nice.
That's true.
So if you're
You
using
hear
the
what she
HOA,
said? I am nice. That's a good
you
point.
are. Nice and funny, both.
What?
So if you're using the HOA addendum and you're not going to have an option period, you just need to be aware that no matter how many days you put in A1, that it's whenever the buyer receives the document. So if you put 10 days in there and the HOA documents are delivered on day 3, you don't get those full 10 days. You only
You're
get
right.
3 days after. So you just have to be careful if that's your strategy, that you don't tell your buyer, well, I'm putting 10 days in here, so we'll have a 10-day free option period.
So Marcia makes a great point because it is tied to the receipt of the information. And there is a tendency for a buyer to think, well, I've at least got the 10 days. Well, not if I get it to you right away. Now, I will say that it's fairly unusual, although good listing agent on a hot piece of property will get this information to buyers very quickly. In fact, they may have already ordered everything up even before they put it on the market. So they can get this to a buyer. And so a buyer may have a very limited amount of time. In fact, they may only have 3 days. So when you're using this in lieu of the option, you need to understand, as Marcia points out, that this number of days in A1 doesn't automatically give you that number of days plus the 3. It's all based on the receipt of. And good listing agents are going to pull this stuff together. Good listing agent in this office, good listing agent, not in my top 10%, in my top 10. Misunderstood this. And in a conversation with her, we were talking about this. And I said, so, and she had the seller, said, so have you gotten the HOA information to the buyer? Oh, Bob, don't worry about that. They gave us 20 days, so we got plenty of time left. She did not understand what she was giving up, what the seller is giving up by not having that information to the buyer. She totally missed it. And she's a good agent. And she just never thought about it, never looked at it like that. So Marcia's right. We need to understand what this really means and how it affects the buyer and the seller as you work through it. So if you've got a hot piece of property, talk to your seller about being ready to pay for this information right up front, because if buyer sends an offer, it's A1 checked off, the seller's gonna pay for it anyway. But get this stuff done right away. So once the seller ends the contract, you can get this to the buyer immediately. And so they've only got 3 days after they received it. So thank you, Marcia. Great point. As usual,
I love that. Thank you.
Yep. So does everybody understand what we're doing there, how it works?
It's safer for me to go home.
Yes, it is safer for you to go home. Yeah, you're being in good stead. And Larry's doing a good job in the class, stay awake almost the entire time.
Yeah, right.
Oh, well, I know. Well, he's had a busy day, as you know, so. Okay, so now let's go to the very next page as we're continuing to talk about the multiple offer scenarios and different things to think about. This is a page from, I've got an expanded multiple offer class, but this deals with a couple of points. Whoops, what happened? There we go. These are 7 examples of criteria for a seller. And following that are questions that we ask of all buyers. So the first criteria is the buyer's lender. Now, there's a little bit more than just the buyer's lender. Listing agent in helping the seller decide on an offer. If it's a really good offer, the sellers really say, I like that offer a lot. And if there's financing, the listing agent not only needs to look at who the buyer's lender is, but need to talk to the buyer's lender. Need to have a conversation. Because if you can't have a good conversation, then it's not going to get better after there's a contract. And what you want to know is, you want to know things about that, particularly if you've got a buyer who's made an offer and there's maybe a proof of funds issue, large reserves, large down payment, maybe they're waiving, if the buyer's made an offer and they're waiving the appraisal addendum, you want to ask the buyer's lender, can they do that? Have they got the reserves? Have they got the money to take care of a gap? I mean, we've got a $400,000 sales price here and they're going to be in contract for $420,000. Do they have that $20,000? If it appraises for only 40, what if it appraises for $380? Have they got $40,000 to cover that? So you need to have that good conversation with the buyer's lender about that and find out what kind of strength we got. We're not looking for confidential information. We're not trying to violate any privacy rules. We just want this to do it. Now, having said that, by the way, because there's a flip side to this. If you got the buyer, one of the things you'll want your buyer's lender to do is reach out to the listing agent and talk to them about their buyer, sell them on that buyer. Because that'll help, because it's a challenging situation. Even if you've got a minimal, you've got a seller sitting there and looking at 5 offers, which in today's market is not a huge number of offers. They're looking at 5. It's a hard thing for the seller to choose which one of the 5 is most likely to close, which is number 7 here, the most important criteria. And what's going on with the buyer's lender is an important part of that. And so the more good information without any guarantees, without any misrepresentations, but the more information you, the listing agent, can have for your seller about the buyer's lender, the better off your seller is in, better position they're in to make a decision. So that's a good thing. Second, our title is the title company. Now, if it's any of your major retail title companies, Republic, Chicago, Allegiance, Lawyers, Capital, all the normal major ones, no big deal. Not a problem. They're all good. If it's some of your smaller fee attorney offices that a lot of your investor groups like to use, I get a little bit more nervous because remember what the seller is relying on from the title company, not just service getting to closing, but making sure all the right things are done. They get all the stuff from the buyer so they can have a closing. And that in fact, the seller is going to get money at closing that's good money, that's good funds. We don't want a check from the title company. Oh, it's a check. This is, now I would take a check from Republic Title, but ABC Title Company down in Oklahoma, I'm not sure I'd take that. Because you got, ABC Title Company and used cars. So, well, maybe not. So title company can become important. The financial status of the buyer, this will come in your pre-qualification or pre-approval. And this will get down a little bit into some of the questions that we have to ask all buyers. One of the things we need to understand, not all lenders will say in their pre-qualification whether or not the buyer has a house to sell. You've got to ask. And they certainly don't have anything in there that tells the listing agent or the seller that the buyer is in multiple contracts at the same time, using that same lender. The lender would know. And that's another one of the questions that we're going to ask. Any other offers, any other contracts, terminated, all those. We're going to talk about how the buyer deals with those kind of things. So what their financial status is, need to know. I mean, you just really, and we're not asking the lender for personal, financial, what it can be, we say, you know, I know you got a pre-qual letter or a pre-approval letter, and here's the dollars and here's the interest, all that kind of stuff. Help us feel good about this buyer. Because that's hard. I mean, it's really hard for a seller out of even just 5 offers, say, okay, here's one most likely to close. And by the way, until you have that conversation with your seller, they don't understand how important that is. That it doesn't matter what the price is. If it doesn't close, it just doesn't matter. Just into that deal. Terms of the offer, here's where we're looking for things. Things that work for the buyer, I mean, for the seller. Closing dates, sell temporary residential lease. We've talked in another class, we'll probably talk again. There's a tendency for sellers to almost automatically ask for a seller's temporary residential lease. Seller needs to understand there's risk in doing that because they're responsible for that property from closing to when they give possession to the buyer. Things could happen, especially this time of year, storms coming through. They need to be concerned with that. But we're having sellers just automatically ask for and want that, and they want it for free. So, you know, we need a couple of weeks, we need it free. And so that's just part of the deal because sellers really going to say to buyers, yeah, I got 5 offers and your offer didn't give us temporary lease. So, you know, have a nice day. So when we look at things like that, in terms of the lease backs, we need to understand, we need to help our client understand there's some risk here. The big thing, it's in paragraph 10 of the contract, it's in paragraph 17 of the lease, 16 of the lease. They've got to talk to their insurance agent and you've got to advise them to do that in writing. Such as an email. You've got to tell your client, you're going to close on a piece of property, you no longer own it, and you're a tenant in that property for the next 2 weeks. If something happens, whose insurance takes control? And while in paragraph 14 of the lease, it addresses who's responsible for the condition of the property, things that break, whatever. In paragraph 9 of the lease, it also talks about casualty loss. So casualty loss happens, whose insurance is going to take care of? We don't know. We want both the buyer and seller to have talked to their insurance agent. So when this happens, and it will happen over the next couple of months, we will have transactions where this happens. And we better have given written advice to our client. Talk to your insurance agent, see what you need to do. Is there a rider? Is there a coverage? Is there something we need to do to make sure you're covered? And if you can't do anything, what's your risk?
Is there a side that you would consider normal at the, of whose insurance company?
No.
It could be.
No.
Very.
Not only do I not know that, you don't know that, and you'll never make a guess. I promise you, if you give any kind of a guess estimate to your client, it's written in stone and you're liable. So, you know, there is no rhyme or reason.
What was that question, Bob?
I'm sorry, the question was, is there a norm of which insurance agent for buyer seller might cover it? And the reality is there is no norm. And I had a follow-up questions here of,
Both sides.
pardon me?
Both sides. Is there-
Could it be both? Could be. We don't know. Here's the big thing. Your client's going to ask you. In fact, you may have had the experience personally, and it may even be the same insurance company your client had. Well, yeah, I've got ABC, and here's what they did. So we were great. If you say that and it happens anything different with this client, you're liable. So you don't say that. What you say in writing, you need to talk to your insurance agent. You need to find out what they say. Whatever they say, that's how you make a decision. You can't be the one that has them make that decision. I mean, that's huge. That's one of like 3 absolute rules that you have to follow in every transaction when there's a lease back. Whether there's a lease back for a seller or a buyer's going to do a lease prior to closing, either way, you have to advise them. That's one of the absolutes. You've got to do it 100% of the time. You can never violate that. The one time you do violate it, what will happen? Storm will come through, roof is gone, or the house is gone, and they're both saying, well, gee, who covers this? Well, my agent said your agent, my agent said your insurance company. Well, my agent said your, and they both look at us. Especially if it happened to be an intermediary relationship where we do the whole thing. They say, well, Keller Williams is responsible for all this. So.
What do you do if, like, we advise our client to talk to their insurance agent? The other side doesn't, let's just say, and something happens. And so our client is covered, the other side has no clue,
Yep.
and then what?
Yeah, so the question, good question. We've advised our client and we have information that the other side did not advise their client and then something happens. We can't fix that. We didn't take them on to raise them. Or we can say to our client, it says, you know, you went through the process, you talked to your insurance agent. And one of the questions you would have asked your insurance agent, by the way, not only my coverage, but what about the other side? What if they either didn't talk to their insurance company or they got bad information and something happens, what's going to happen? So your buyer has as much information they can possibly, I mean, your seller has as much information they possibly can get from their insurance agent, recognizing that unless the seller says, you know what, I want some assurance here. So we're going to put something in an amendment to the contract or in special provisions that requires the buyer to let us, to tell us in writing that they've talked to their insurance agent. We're going to require that. Now, the seller that's going to require that is the seller who had the problem and had it happen, said, I don't want to ever have that happen again. For the most part, we got to avoid adding things like that, but that's the only thing that you could do to require that. It's just something like that.
Wouldn't the mortgage company entitled require them to have insurance?
Well, they'll have insurance. It's not a matter of having insurance, but here's the problem. Seller no longer owns the house. Yesterday, he had a homeowner's policy. He no longer has a homeowner's policy. And remember, the seller's loan has been paid off. So the only mortgage company that may be concerned about insurance is the buyers. Because they now own the property, but they don't have rights of possession. So the buyer's lender is going to say, you need to make sure you've got, in fact, you've got insurance. And the buyer say, oh yeah, I'm insured. In fact, they give us in, we're good and everything's fine. But I don't know how it covers anything. Hello, sir. How are we doing? So you can remind me to make sure I cover whatever was that thing you mentioned that keeps showing up on the legal hotline. What was that? Do you remember?
It was the use of attorney written language to waive the termination right due to low appraisal.
Oh, yeah, an appraisal waiver if it's an FHA or VA. Because we've had this come up, because the appraisal addendum cannot be used on FHA or VA transactions. And so we've had a number of buyers say, well, I've got an attorney who'll put something in special provisions who will say the buyer is waiving his appraisal rights. And the question becomes, and the attorneys don't have a good answer for us, is that, you know, if all of a sudden the buyer changed their mind before closing and they want it out because it didn't appraise, are the FHA rules going to supersede the language that went into the contract? We don't know. So what if a buyer chooses to do that and has an attorney do it, they can do it and the seller can accept it, but both of them need to understand we don't know what could happen. And they accept, you know, and we'll have an email where they acknowledge that we've advised them and they're taking their chances, because that could be a problem. Absolutely. So we got material back there. We're looking on the multiple offers and the criteria of the sellers. And so, you know, we just talked about terms of the offer, so forth. Earnest money, option fee, and option periods. We kind of talked about the option periods when we discussed the situation with the major HOA. Earnest money and option fees. We never know for sure how the seller views this. So as a listing agent, you'll have some conversation with the seller and you'll say, you know, here's how we feel about earnest money. We certainly need to have it be at least a reasonable amount, at least 1% of the sales price, whatever. I've got a bias, and everybody knows, you heard me say it over and over in my class. I've got a bias against cash offers, because too many times, at least a third of the time, cash offers close with financing. Happens over and over again. So I've got a bias against cash offers. If I'm representing the seller says, wow, that's a great cash offer. More than list price, no appraisal issues. This is great. You know, it's a $330,000 cash deal. I say, not a problem. You know what I'd like to see? About $300,000 earnest money. If he's gonna close in a couple of weeks and I want to know where that $330,000 is right now. I want to know that it's in a financial institution in this country now. Because if you put $5,000 down on that, a buyer will walk away from $5,000 on a $330,000 deal. And sellers had this house on the market for whatever the time frame is. So I think a really large amount of earnest money, not 1%, 5%, 10%, 50%. some large amount. And if you're sitting there and 20 offers, 20 good offers, 10 of them are cash, and the seller has the leverage, and seller can send that invitation to submit new offer back, say, you know what? That was a silly amount of earnest money. Here's what I want. If you want to be the one that gets, if a buyer really understands his risk for his earnest money, in the deal that we had, I've talked about this, it was $330,000 sales price, cash deal, $300,000 earnest money. And somebody said to the buyer, says, wow, that's a lot of money at risk. He said, no. It's $5,000, that's at risk. 300,000, that money's not going anywhere. We'll be in court first. Said, I'll be protected on that. So as long as the buyer understands and stays in tune with his right to termination, terms of the contract, his earnest money is not at a great amount of risk. So, but I think a large amount of earnest money, if you've got a large down payment, 50% down, you need to have a lot of earnest money in addition to proof of funds, talk to the lender, those kinds of things. But now you've got to talk to your seller and see how important this is to your seller, which may be based on what their most recent experience was in dealing with earnest money. So you know what? I've never been able to get the earnest money. Buyer always got it. I don't want to fight it. I want to be able to sell my house to somebody else. So I don't really care how much earnest money there is. It doesn't really make any difference. So that's going to really depend on what the seller thinks about it. Any thoughts on that, Nick? One way or the other?
No, it's a little bit of an uphill climb to explain that to the agent on the other side who's not used to that. So the practical side of it is getting somebody on the other side who understands why you're doing what you're doing, what the seller's asking for.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So, and here's the script for that. So Nick said, and I talked about a conversation about large earnest money, whatever, and Nick's right. The challenge is educating the other side, saying, you know, the other side, here's why the seller's wanting this, is how that works. The script, the casual script you have says, you know what? Thanks for your offer. It's a great offer. We've got 10 of them. And you know what seller's looking at? He's looking at the earnest money. I'm not telling you how much earnest money is going to get you the deal, but you need to know that seller's looking at the earnest money. That's kind of an important thing for the seller. So as you're thinking about your offer over any other offers, whatever you'd like to do, you just might give that some thought. It's soft, but you're exactly right. Because if you push too hard, you may run off the best buyer, the buyer who has the highest certainty to close. So you want to be careful as you work through that. Now, the option fee is a little bit of a different conversation. We're seeing much, much higher option fees, 500, 1,000. Here's your challenge. And because in the new contracts, the option fee is automatically credited to the sales price at closing. That's an automatic. You don't have two boxes and check one off. Buyer can still change that by going to special provision saying, you know, option fee will not be credited to the sales price. So that's just money straight. That's a bribe to the seller. But otherwise, if you don't do that, it gets credited. Now, the risk of a buyer putting a large amount of option fee down, such as $1,000, it just destroys their leverage on repairs. Because seller says, you know, you've asked for repairs and looks to me like that's about $800 or so, but I don't think we're going to do them. And if you go away, thanks for $1,000. We're going to go to lunch now. Have a nice day. So you want to be careful with if you get too much of an option fee, too large an amount, while on one hand, it might look really good. And I don't have a problem with the 250s, the 300s, even the 500s on the higher price ranges. But when you get much above that, you really impact on the leverage the buyer has for negotiating repairs. And I think if your buyer is a really aggressive buyer, then I would say, and if they say, you know what, we want this house, our life is not complete if we don't get this house, whatever it takes to get this house, $1,000, not credited to the sales price. Make that change in the contract. Then buyer needs to understand, what you've got to understand is there's now no incentive for the seller to close the deal because he's got $1,000. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. What are you going to do? Sue the seller? No, I'm not going to do that. So there's a risk there. But if you've determined for your buyer as they're competing that the option fee is an important thing for the other side, as long as the buyer understands the risk, as long as you're able to educate the seller and you find out from the listing agent, yeah, Listening at my stage, I'm like, you know what? I had 10 offers, they're all really good offers. And frankly, I'm really surprised at how high the option fee has gotten to be. You know, I used to say 100, 150. Now I'm seeing 250, 500. He just told you that this option fee may be a big deal. And so you just need to help the buyer and saying, yeah, here's the risk. And from a buyer standpoint, geez, you're going to pay 20,000 more than the list price and you're fussing about $500 on an option? Really? It's like, you know, and I just had this. It was in Rockwall. And they sit there and they go, so, hey, we want to make a really great offer, really, really good offer, and we want to split the cost of the title policy. Really? Why are you trying to get the seller to pay half the cost of the title policy when you're offering them 30, in this case, 35,000 more than list price? And you want them to pay half the title policy? That clouds your offer. Why would you even do that? So you gotta find out. And we talked about the option periods, work through that. Net to the seller is important. For one of the challenges, this is where you earn your big bucks. When you got all those offers, for any offer, not for all of them, but any offer that's closed that your seller is going to consider, you better have a net. Trek requires you to have a net for the seller. If anything happens and you didn't do a net for the seller, Trek will find you negligent. So you want a net for your seller. Making sure your seller understands it's an estimate, and make sure your seller understands the big variable here that you have no control over is the payoff on their loan, any of their costs. Did I hear a question?
Yeah, Bob, Megan O.
Megan O. Trouble?
You need to use like the formal net sheet calculator out of Netris. I put it all in a spreadsheet.
Okay. So you automatically have it on all the offers.
Correct.
Okay, and that's fine. You know, if it's done automatic, as you put the numbers in there, so you don't have to put a lot of time and effort in each one, then that's fine. If you've got something that sets that up, you know, she just went way beyond my level of technology understanding, so that's good. I'm glad you have that for you, Megan.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's good. Yeah, that's a good thing. But certainly on any that don't ever let your seller accept an offer without a net sheet. Make sure wherever you get it, from one of the title companies, from Netris, wherever, make sure you have that done. And make sure they understand the variables. And ideally, I would like to see you get a email acknowledgement back from your seller saying, okay, I understand this is an estimate and there are all kinds of possible variables here, and I might end up getting a lot more or a lot less, and that's the real world. So net's important. The most important and the hardest to do is number 7, certainty of close. That's the absolute most important. And your seller needs to know that, because your seller just gets the bright eyes and just go, wow, Mike, look at how much more. I mean, I think Marcia was talking about it, 100,000 more than list price. That was like $1 million piece of property, but still 100,000 more. That's crazy. You know, it doesn't mean anything if it's not going to close. So the certainty of close is the hardest, and it's the one that you need to educate your seller, saying, you know what, of all things we're talking about, if it doesn't close, nothing happens. Most importantly, seller, you know, I know you don't get to sell your house, you don't get your money, but I don't get my money. I mean, you know, I got that Mercedes payment coming up and I need this thing to close. So we need to make sure you enter a contract with buyer is going to close. We just need to make sure that's done. And I only say that a little bit facetiously, because you do have that payment coming up and you got to take care of that. Work through that. Now, questions for all the buyers. These are questions you ask of all buyers, and we've kind of talked about some of them, but what's important to you on the buy side, because we know a good listing agent is going to ask these questions, you already should be answering them. You already should go ahead and communicate with them if you have your buyer's permission. We went from fairly recently, in the last 5 years, certainly in the good old days, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the buyer's objective was to find the perfect house. Now the buyer's objective is to get into a contract. If I can just get into a contract, everything's okay. We'll work on the details later. And they're getting desperate, because all you got to do is read the newspaper, check the media when they talk about how big the problems are. There's no inventory. Buyers are desperate, and buyers are, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so buyers do it. Now, because of that, back in the good old days, you wouldn't waste time with the buyer who's making an offer on multiple properties, unless there was a good legitimate reason. Best legitimate reason is a relocation. This is our last weekend to make a decision, and we've got to make a couple of offers to see which one is a possibility, because we got to decide on a house this week. A few of those kinds of things. Otherwise, yeah. But in today's world, you get that buyer and they're desperate. And they say, you know, we got 3 houses that any of them would be okay. But we got to make offers on all 3. Now, you don't have to tell the listing agent. The buyer doesn't have to tell the listing agent. You can't tell the listing agent without the buyer's permission. That's confidential information. Unless 2 of the offers they're making is from the same office. It's a small office and they kind of talk to each other, but otherwise, so as you go through that. But if the listing agent asks you, and they should, a good listing agent in a multiple offer situation, frankly, in any situation, but certainly in a multiple offer, should always ask nicely. You know, seller is concerned because there's so much going on out there, and you're always going to lay it off on your client. Seller's concerned because we know a lot of buyers are making multiple offers because they're so desperate to get into something. And my seller is just, you know, curious, is your buyer in other offers? Is your buyer in other contracts? They don't have to tell you. They can't lie to you. But anything they say other than no, they just told you. Oh man, my buyer hadn't given me permission to tell you that. Well, you just did. Thank you very much. So you want to go through. So for the buyer side, if your buyer is not in multiple offers, tell the listing agent. Hey, you should know my buyer is really serious about this property. In fact, they're so serious, this is the only property they're making an offer on. That's a good information for a listing agent to have. Because a good listing agent was getting ready to ask the question anyway, now you've taken care of it. So as you work through that, you're also going to ask if they're in contract on other properties because they're getting contracts and their only risk is the option fee. Maybe not even that if it's in a major HOA. So look through that. It's harder to get into a conversation on the other questions. Well, this last one, not the last, the third one. Have you previously terminated purchase contracts? That almost feels like you're really getting meddling here. You're really getting nosy, but you'd want to know, wouldn't you? Who was it? Oh, Cindy Shell, who apologized. She was going to be here, but she couldn't. She's got to go take care of something for her client for a closing. And she told me, she said, and she's got a really good buyer. She says, longtime client, sends me all kind of referral, good person, but she's already gotten into 2 contracts and canceled both of them. For good reason, there things happen, and we understand that. But from the listing side, before my seller accepts that buyer's offer, I'd like to know if that's kind of their habit. They keep getting into a contract and they keep terminating, especially if they're investors. Because investors get into a contract and then they see if they can find somebody to sell it to or flip it to or whatever. And if that doesn't work out, then they terminate and move on. So we kind of like to know. It's harder to get them to give that information. Do they have a house to sell? You've got to ask that. You have to ask that. They don't have to tell you. Lenders don't have to tell you. Most lenders, many lenders don't have it in their pre-qual letters. You have to ask. You have a house to sell, especially if you're putting down a large down payment where you get the money. If, many buyers will view a cash deal. Well, it's all cash. I'm getting the money from the sale of my other property. So it's all cash. That's why it's a cash offer. Really? So everything is continuing selling the other property. Well, let's use that addendum. Let's stick that in there. Let's work through the process, or let's make sure the seller understands you've got a house to sell. And then we want all kinds of good information. In this market, by the way, if your buyer has a house to sell, a good buyer's agent should be able to put together the package so it's a non-question. It's not a problem at all. Yeah, my buyer is moving up. Not so $500,000 listing you've got here. They've got a $250,000 one-story in Frisco. It'll sell in 3 minutes. So it's not really a problem, but they don't want to have the possibility of being in default. So we're going to use the addendum. Well, you got a good listing package, you got a CMA, you got all the information on that property. Seller says, and this is your best offer. Otherwise, this is the only offer with a contingency though. Well, yeah, but it's really not, is it? Probably not. Let's go through that. And then have you physically visited the property? We're reviewing that a little differently than we had in the past. Particularly, many of our agents have investors from out of the area. And they typically don't visit the property before making an offer. That's not an uncommon thing. Now, the seller needs to make a decision because frankly, it's a little bit of a risk. It's a little higher risk than someone who's actually seen the property. We have the other situation where spouse is coming in, trailing spouse, relocation, whatever, and only one of them has seen it. Now, the one that's probably, in most cases, and I hate to be sexist about this, but the one that's probably the most important to see it is the wife. Because she can cancel that thing in a heartbeat. Oh my gosh, you told me this was a great house. Look at, so anyway, but that depends. Certainly in my relationship with my wife, 53 years, she is the one. Because she's the one that said, what you were thinking, boy, this doesn't work at all. Have you seen who lives next door? People from Oklahoma. Boy, that's not good. So have to work through it. Any questions on the multiple offers and the things that you should do from both the listing side and the buyer side? As you work through that? Any
Yes,
questions
Bob.
on Zoom, people? Are we good?
Yes, Bob, got a question.
Yes, some question.
If my buyer does put out multiple offers and it gets one accepted, I should withdraw the other offers. But if they've already accepted one, do I still have to withdraw?
Okay, so let me clarify your question, Megan. So you've got a buyer and they've made 3 offers and one of them has been accepted?
Correct?
So is your question, should you withdraw the other 2?
Correct.
My absolute clear answer is it depends. Because the reality is the one that they have accepted, they're in contract. And what's their position moving forward on that? They got an option fee at risk. They're about to schedule an inspection, so they got an inspection fee. The other 2 offers, if something happens and either of the other 2 get accepted, are they really happier with that other one than the one that you're in contract with? So they've got to look at the 3. So you know what? I know we're in a contract, so we've got a safety net here that if nothing else works out, we at least have this house. But we'd really like house number 3 if at all possible. So they may wait. Now you got to help the buyer look at the timeline. Everybody understand Megan's question on this? So you've got to help them with the timeline on when things need to be done, when they're at risk for doing inspections and fees and those kinds of things. But I think they've got to look at how they feel about the other 2 houses that they don't have an offer accepted yet, as to whether or not they're going to withdraw those offers. It could be that the ideal house of the 3 was the one that was accepted. Hey, this is great, perfect. Okay, let's pull out of the others. And then you use the withdrawal of offer form, either the Texas Realtors one or ours, and use that to withdraw the offer. And then you're good. Does that make sense?
Yes. In this case, though, the other 2 properties went under contract as well. So I don't need to do
Okay, so
it.
they made offers and both those others are in contract and your buyer is not interested in doing a backup.
No, because they're in contract for.
Okay, so there's really not a need to withdraw those offers because when the seller accepts somebody else's offer in contract, it voids any offers. If your buyer is really antsy about things, there's no downside to say, okay, so you're in contract, great, wish you well, and we're withdrawing our offer, even though we don't need to. So, but yeah, you could do that. Because what could happen is that contract they're in falls apart and your offer is still sitting there and say, oh, you know what? They never pulled that offer back. Let's go and accept it. So just as a safety factor, probably go ahead and pull it back. Good. Okay, so let's go to the next page. And this is the 1-to-4 family contract. And by now, and comfortable may be too strong a word, but you're probably getting really comfortable with this now. Because we've had it for what? Almost 3 weeks. Yeah, it's a good deal. So the big thing is the big issues that come up on the first page of it, dealing with paragraph 4. Make sure on the buyer side that you've been able to have a conversation with a listing agent about fixtures and fixture leases. Don't just rely on what's in the seller's disclosure notice, because when your buyer makes an offer, particularly on fixture leases, you're dealing with a fixed release addendum that the buyer has to make choices on. And we've got that in right after this, the 3 pages for the contract form. So you need to make sure that that's made, because before we had the conversations about fixed releases, but now because it's actually in the contract, when the buyer makes an offer, they've got to make a choice in paragraph 4. If there are no fixed releases, no residence releases, you just don't do anything in paragraph 4. Leave everything blank. Don't check any boxes. But if there is, got to check it off and got to include that addendum. Next page, dealing with paragraph 5. You know, this was the big emotional change. The option fee being paid to the title company, check made out to the order of the title company. Option fee and earnest money can be paid in one amount or separately. What we discovered, and it was interesting, is I talked to one of the title companies, said, yeah, it's counts for us. The formatting is different because the blanks are different, different places, and where you check things off, because you don't have it just paragraph 5 earnest money, paragraph 23 option. Sometimes we miss, and we've had at least one agent who just missed putting anything in the option fee. Because they said, well, I got additional earnest money, you just kind of slip right past it. So make sure you pay attention to it. The big thing, and I've not heard any problems with it, is if you're going to combine the option fee and the earnest money, make sure whatever the check is the buyer makes out is correct. Because the option fee will be credited first. And if there's not enough money left over for the earnest money, then the seller can terminate the contract after 3 days. Your buyer could lose out on the deal. So make sure you're pretty comfortable with that. Questions on that? We good? Everybody doing good on the option thing and how that works and all those provisions?
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
just as an observation, now that the option fee is being delivered with the earnest money, when you get to closing and you get the final settlement statement, you won't see it as a credit from the seller to the buyer because it doesn't really get delivered to the seller. So it's combined as one thing as a credit, but it doesn't show it as a.
Yeah, it doesn't show anything coming from the seller.
Correct.
Yeah, because unless the seller did get it.
Yes.
Okay, you know, because the seller may have said, I want to see that $500, so send it to me.
Correct.
In that case, you're right. But otherwise, it's just a smooth, easy thing and title companies really like it. And frankly, buyers do too. Because it's all handled at closing and it works out well. So a good point. You won't show it because as you pour over and look at the closing statement to advise your client, say, well, where's this money from the seller? Well, seller never had it. Title company always had it. And title company just giving the credit to the buyer. And it's a good point. Should work through that.
Like we have one that the fell out right before closing. And
You have the buyer or seller?
we have the seller.
Okay.
And on the old contract, we were talking through it because it had it been on this contract, we had had it on the new contract. What do you do about the option?
Okay, so the question is, deal fell out right before closing, has the seller. So what do we do about the option fee at that point in time? Because the title company still has it. So if you look in paragraph 5, and it talks about dealing with this particular situation. In 5B, where it talks about the termination option, towards the end, talks about the option fee will not be refunded. Escrow agent shall release any option fee remaining with escrow agent to seller. So at that point in time, that day before, the title company has that $500 and they're going to release that to the seller. Now, the practical side of that is how are they going to do it? You know, they're not going to wire simply funds for $100, $150, $500. So what they probably would do is, because at that point in time, they have got good funds. They knew it cleared the bank. What they'll probably do is cut a check and somebody will come and pick it up. But that right there takes care of getting that option fee that the title company still has to the seller.
So then would you put it on your release of earnest and just include it, even though it's not?
No.
It just
No.
would be separate.
That's covered with this right here. Yeah. Good question. Okay, good. Okay, so any questions on that before I go to the paragraph 10 of the contract? And I only included 3 pages of the contract because these are the three areas that are probably most to be concerned with. Paragraph 10 and 10B, we deal with smart devices. And this is going to be more and more and more of an issue. Even with examples, even with what it says, smart device means a device that connects to the internet to enable remote use and so forth. The challenge is we think technology is evolving so quickly that it will soon doesn't have to be connected to the internet for it to be a smart device. We think there'll be other provisions, other situations. We don't have any idea what they are, but I'm sure Elon Musk is working on it. So we'll work on it. But anyway, right now, that's what we're talking about. And there's some requirements here, as you talk about the smart devices. The seller shall deliver to buyer written information under paragraph 10B1 containing all access codes, usernames, passwords, applications, so forth. What has immediately come up? So I say, whoa, I use the same passwords for this as I do in about 10 other things. I'm not giving them those passwords. So what you want to do on the listing side is when if your seller has some smart devices, is right now you need to change all your passwords for these devices to unique passwords for these devices. So when this thing is going to close, what you're giving up is passwords that are only used for these devices. So you don't have to worry about any others you have, because you've got to be able to give those to the buyer, work through it. And then the seller has to terminate, remove all access connections and improvements so that they can't later after closing still be able to do things to the property. Everybody good with that? Because that's something that came up and we said, wow, okay. I hadn't thought through that. Neither had the broker lawyer committee and saying, well, I hadn't thought about that being a problem. Well, but it is. It's just like what I read a thing the other day, because I'm always right on top of technology. I mean, that's my forte. And it said that still, I want to say the number was almost a third of people, their password is still password. That's still what they use as their official password, is the word password. Really, even I've moved on from that, so. Third-party financing addendum. From we need to have a sense of what we're doing here from a negotiation standpoint. On the buyer side, our challenge on the buyer side is to get into a contract and to make it as attractive an offer as possible. So when we look at the contingencies, first of all, we look at it from a conventional loan standpoint, and we look at the approval of financing in paragraph 2, and we look at 2A. And in 2A, you've got a blank for a number of days for buyer approval. Nothing to do with the property, just the buyer. The shorter the time frame there, the better it is for the seller. So it says, we're going to close in 30 days, and you've got 30 days in here. We stretch all the way to the end. That's not good. So now, whatever the time frame is, though, needs to be a time frame that the buyer's lender has said to the buyer, yeah, here's for buyer approval. Make sure the lender sends buyer approval. Here's the time frame. And probably, a reasonable time frame could be 10, 14, 15 days, something like that. Now, there is a choice when you look at the second page of the third-party financing addendum. And you look at the very top there, right before you get to 2B. You see there's a box that can be checked there. Right above property approval, that this contract is not subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. Now, effectively, that takes away the buyer approval contingency. You cannot check that box for FHA and VA, only a conventional. FHA, VA rules we feel like will supersede the choice. Now, the buyer who might want to check this box is a buyer who is so strong, you say, you know what? I'm just doing financing because the rates are so great, but if I had to, I could pay cash. I mean, no risk of being in default here. So if the buyer checks this off, it typically will improve the offer because there's no buyer approval contingency. But you're going to have to really point that out to the listing agent. Because, you know, financing is a big contingency and a buyer can terminate within that time frame. They don't have to have anything from the lender saying why they're terminating. They don't have any proof. Just during that time frame, buyer can terminate for buyer approval, whatever that means. But if you like, can do it, they can do it. So this is an important contingency that the buyer is removing. But the buyer needs to understand the risk. That's an important contingency they are giving up. So then you understand the risk of giving that up and working through that process and dealing with that. So that's just something to be considered with a really, really strong buyer on a conventional loan. Now, property approval. You know, we've talked in other classes and we probably don't need to go totally through it again, but you know, we've got the appraisal addendum where you can deal with the appraisal waiver. And that's all that it deals with. Here, the property approval not only deals with the appraisal, it deals with all underwriting requirements, which could be title and insurance, underwriting repairs, anything else. And it talks about those in here. The key with property approval for conventional loans is if the buyer is going to terminate based on property approval. And it may be because insurability in a condo situation, they don't have proper reserves or insurance or what, it could be whatever, something other than appraisal, or it could be appraisal that didn't use the addendum. The buyer has to terminate before 3 days prior to closing. And they've got to have something from the lender stating why they do not approve the property on conventional. On FHA or VA, the 3 days doesn't apply. It goes all the way to closing. So FHA rules give the buyer all the way to closing to terminate if we have a problem with property approval. But if you're doing it otherwise, if you're doing it on conventional, when that 3rd day hits, it's too late to terminate under that provision. So you make sure that you've done that. Now, down in paragraph 4, which is your FHA VA, there's an interesting thing that's come up, and we're not entirely sure. We understand the strategy. We're not entirely sure if it's going to really work out. In paragraph 4, you've got a blank, and normally that's the sales price. That's typical. So you got a $300,000 sales price, and the buyer puts $300,000 in there. So if it doesn't appraise to the sales price, you can get out of the deal. FHA is not going to make him buy. And so a buyer may say, well, you know, I'll cover a gap of $5,000. So instead of putting $300,000 here, we're putting $295,000. And what that appears to be is the buyer saying, if it appraises for $295,000 or more, I've got to cover the gap. I'll still do the deal. Because FHA and VA both allow the buyer to come in with additional money to do the deal. They still don't require it. So the feeling is by doing that, from a value standpoint, an appraisal standpoint, the buyer is kind of committing to cover that gap. We're not familiar with any test cases. We don't really know that's a fact, but it's an interesting strategy. And if the buyer's agent does that and explains it to the listing agent, they say, oh, that's a great idea. I'm gonna do that on one of mine. Yeah, what a good idea. Okay, so might work out, but it's just a thought of how that could go. Questions on that? We good? Okay. Now, buyer's letters. And Jill and I are going to meet, may or may not involve Mike. We're going to talk about coming up with a well-worded policy to advise us on this. So here's the concept of our concern. What I have here on these 2 pages, NAR last October 23rd, did an article, and the title of the article was Love Letters or Liability Letters. And NAR basically said that when a buyer sends those letters in to a seller to try to get the seller to accept their offer, they may be violating federal law. They may be talking about protected classes. They may do some things that put the buyer and the seller both at risk. Probably more the seller than the buyer, but could be at risk. And so best practices advice from NAR was don't do it. If you're gonna do it, here's some best practices advice here. So we're concerned about that. So we've made inquiries. I first made inquiry to Trek. And I got a response here. You'll see here from the bottom of this first page from Abby Lee, who's the Deputy General Counsel for Trek. Says, at this point in time, they don't have any significant increasing of this, but it might happen because they're having that happen a lot, particularly in Austin. There've been some articles in the paper and so forth. We just had a situation with one of our agents who lost a deal. It was a multiple offer. And his buyer lost out to another buyer, almost identical offer, but the other buyer had a letter. And the listing agent said to our agent, you know what? That letter is what caused the seller to take that. And our agent said, we could have written a letter exactly like that because our buyer had the same situation. But our agent said, I didn't advise the buyer to do it because of the risk that we think is there. So we've got to come up with something because it is a concern, and we think in multiple offers, many buyers may feel the need to do something, that one extra little thing that kind of moves their offer off the pile into something a little special, or at least gets the attention of the seller. The real risk is if you do anything, and you see this, and on the next page, you see something from, I had Marvin Jolly reach out to Lori Levy, the General Counsel for Texas Realtors, and she got some things in there. The risk is if the seller accepts an offer from a buyer and there's anything dealing with a protected class, the seller could be in violation of federal law and subject to prosecution. So it could be a very serious problem for a seller.
But the buyer not.
Well, not so much the buyer, but it could also be the buyer. If the buyer, for example, used a protected class in their letter to convince a seller to do it, they may be in violation of discrimination. So it's a greater risk on the seller side than the buyer side, which means it's a greater risk for the listing agent than the buyer's agent. And so you need to have a conversation. And one of the conversations you probably need to have with the seller is, you know what? We expect a lot of offers. Some of the buyers may want to send the letters along with the offer. What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? And then we talk to them about the risk back and forth, up and down, what the problems may be. So say, you know what? I don't want to see any letters. You've got my permission, but if you get offers with the letters, either I don't want to see the offer at all, or I don't want to see any letters.
So the letters really won't stop until it's a bigger risk for the buyer's agent.
Probably not. Yeah. Or until they see sellers say, don't want them, not going to look at them. So don't even send them. And that's going to happen. Because we're in an environment now where discrimination is a major concern, as it should be, because there are a lot of challenges out there. And so we're going to see buyers now. A good letter from a buyer that does not address any protected classes would be fine. The buyer says, you know what? I find a lot of people want to support the troops, and I've just separated from the military, and we're going to settle here in Plano. I'd just like to encourage you this would be a good way for you to support the troops. Accept a letter from a veteran. Well, that's not a protected class. That's not a problem. So something where you can make a case and not be dealing with any protected classes. But if you send somebody say, you know what? I'm from the old country and you're from the old country and we need to take care of ourselves, don't we? We need to take care of our people. We just, no, not protected class. So we got to work through that.
I have a question.
Question. Yes, ma'am.
As a listing agent, when I present multiple offers to my sellers, I do not tell them about a letter until the end and until we've reviewed all of the offers based off terms. And then I say, this one had, letters, if they didn't already cut that one out of the pile, because I don't see the need to tell them about a letter if they've already determined they don't like the offer itself. So I guess
Can everybody hear Megan's example? It's and I hate to say this to you because I know you get the big head. That's a good practice. That's probably a good idea. Because it may well be that the letter has no impact on anything because it wasn't one of the ones that seller even considered. So they didn't have to deal with it. You do want to still have a conversation with your seller up front and let the seller know, here's what I'm going to do. The seller may say, you know what, while I'm considering offers, I want to see the letters too. That's a decision the seller can make. You would advise them against it. So here's why you don't want to take that risk. I think it's a good practice to go ahead and go through the process on the offers. And then after the fact, if some of the offers that they're seriously considering have letters, then you better have a good, serious conversation with your seller about whether or not they want to see the letters or not. So I think it's a great practice. That's a good
Bob,
idea.
this
So you
is-
totally eliminate the problem with offers, with letters. Did I hear
Bob?
another conversation on this?
Yes, this is Christina. What about if you have the conversation with your seller and the seller decides to opt away from receiving those letters? Can you add that to your offer instructions in MLS and request that no love letters be sent?
Yeah, so the question is, if the listing agent, if the seller says, I don't want any offers, any letters with the offers, and they give you that written instruction, then part of your package to buyer's agents and your instructions in MLS or wherever say, yeah, seller has made the decision they do not want to consider any offers with letters from the buyers. Now, that may or may not keep them from doing it, but it certainly will reduce it. But yeah, seller absolutely gets to make that decision and you get to send that instruction out.
Thank you.
Good idea. Any follow-up on Megan's idea?
Well, Bob,
Good
if
idea.
you, yeah, Bob, if this is James,
Yes,
if you
James.
don't, if you don't have that conversation, or not us, but say another agency hasn't done that, wouldn't the offer not be fully presented because the letter's part of their offer? And couldn't the
Okay,
agency
so the
sue?
good question James has is the offer part of the offer, is a letter part of the offer. We don't have a ruling on that. In fact, there's an interesting challenge that we have when we have something, our client has it through imputed knowledge and imputed notice. That doesn't appear to flow through to letters that go along with an offer. It does flow through for other information that we have. For example, when a buyer's agent sends the listing agent the inspection report, seller has it. We don't know that that's the same thing on a letter. We've asked that direct question of Texas Realtor Legal. We don't have a good answer yet. We're going to press Marvin a little bit more on trying to get us something on that. I think the seller gets to make a decision because it's not part of the offer itself. It doesn't affect any of the terms of the contract. It's just an additional thing where, the buyer is giving some additional information for whatever reason. So we do think the seller has the right to say, I don't want offers. I don't want letters. So we think the seller has, right, but you want that in writing. You want your seller to give you an email saying, here are your instructions. But you need to have that conversation with your seller and deal with that and work through that. If you send an offer over and you've got the buyer and there's a letter with it, there's no telling what will happen on the other side because they may or not have had this conversation at all. But it is an area of concern and we do need to be aware of it and we need to be able to deal with it at some level because it can be a little bit of a challenge. Does that make semi-sense? Kind of? We good?
Yeah.
So we're working on coming up with maybe a better explanation of how this should be worked. Hopefully get some more guidance from our legal beagles at Texas Realtors. Trek has really pulled back and say, we're not going to take a position on this. Although they kind of quietly, softly said, if this ends up in a complaint, the agent could well be found negligent. Just like the use of a escalation clause, which we might want to touch on briefly. An escalation clause is one in which the buyer adds something to their offer saying to the seller, we'll pay $1,000 more than your next highest offer. Now, it's not illegal in Texas. It's enormously ill-advised at huge high levels. When I reached out to Trek about escalation clauses, they said, you know what? Not illegal, better not be done unless it's an attorney. And if an agent's involved on any level, they could be found negligent. So it's a very high risk thing. It's a real challenge for the seller. Because if a buyer makes an offer and they say, we'll offer $1,000 more than any other offer, and their offer is not accepted, buyer's going to sue the seller. Hey, you know what? Discrimination. There's no reason for you not to accept our offer because it's better than any other offer. What they just said was the most important thing in the whole deal is paragraph 3C, the sales price. Nothing else counts. Well, we know that's not true. The other thing is it's a really bad thing for the buyer. It's a bad business thing for the buyer. How do you prove it up? Nice $400,000 listing. I'll pay $1,000 more than your next highest offer. So I said, listening, he said, oh, okay, that's great. I've heard about this. That's great. Okay, our next highest offer was $500,000 on that $400,000 listing. So you're going to agree to $501,000. That's great. Seller would love that. How you proving it up? No way to prove it up. Even they said, well, send over, the contract or the offer. We're going to redact the people in there. How do you prove it's even real? You can't. There's no legitimate, it's just a terrible decision in both cases, but we're having it happen a lot. We got people coming in from California. They do it a lot there. We got to help our client understand we're not going to do an escalation clause. It's ill-advised and doesn't work and it doesn't really help you. Let's just help you make your best offer based on what's going on this property. We good? Does that make semi-sense? Question on that? Any other questions we got? Because I'm done. I think we've mostly covered these things that we've got here. And I'm certainly open to any other ideas or thoughts or things you say, hey, you know what? Has everybody thought about this? Because they ought to know about this, whatever this is. Anything from the fine Zoom folks? You guys did good. You had some good suggestions, some ideas in there, good questions.
Thank you, Bob. Great class.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for all being here. If I have no more questions, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Presuming I even have a clue on how to turn this off now. Huh? You know how to turn it off? Yeah. Whoever can turn it off, turn it off. I mean, there's a thing, because we're on a Zoom here to leave the meeting, but I don't even see where that is.
Bob, we're going to have to move you to vice president of the tech committee instead of president.
We're gonna have to move me to what?
Vice president of the tech committee.
You know what? I could be the vice chair of tech, because you know what? She makes a good point. Before you hit leave, here's a good point. My ignorance in technology creates a patience for me to be more patient with people who don't understand contracts. Because I know we all have something we don't understand. We just went through a migration of our emails last Friday. And the tech people said, okay, here's what you do. You close out Outlook and you keep the device open and we'll do the migration. I said, you know what? I have no idea how to do that. I don't know how to close out Outlook and keep my device. I don't know what that means. And he just shook his head and says, how can you be that ignorant? But I don't understand it. I don't understand how that works. So that keep causing me to be paid. When you look at a paragraph of contract, say, Bob, I read it, but I still don't understand it. I'm much more patient because I understand things we all don't understand. So I think vice chair, because if I understand it on the vice chair committee, then anybody will understand it. I'm a great test thing there.
Well, you're very talented, just not in the tech world. Okay, see ya.
Well, thank you guys. How many do we end up having?
Okay. Think about it this way, you're opening huge jobs for other people.
What?
A huge job opportunity.
Yes, absolutely.
You're employing a lot of
of